Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is David Hoffman, and I teach in the Columbia University Bioethics Master's Program. And I am especially thrilled by the program we have for you tonight, Automation Complacency, AI-induced abdication of medical decision-making, legal and ethical challenges in implementation. Yes, a mouthful. But what we have for you is really an entry-level discussion of why we should be cautious about the implementation of AI tools in the healthcare realm, and specifically why, obviously, healthcare is different from other disciplines and warrants special attention. A little required legal notice for those of you in the audience who are attorneys and are looking for continuing legal education credit to fulfill your cybersecurity, privacy, and data protection continuing education requirement. You will have to copy down two participation codes, one toward the middle of the program and one at the end, and fill those in on your participation form and submit that to us along with your evaluation in order to get your New York State certificate of participation and attendance, qualifying you for CLE credit. A little more legal requirements because, there are lawyers involved here. This is our panel. It's quite a remarkable group. Varied backgrounds and geography. I am here in New York. Michael Sadek is in California. Emily Beer is in Vermont. Camille is in South Africa. Yoel is in Finland. And Larry is also in Vermont, but in northern Vermont. And each of us has attested that we have no financial or other substantive conflicts of interest, but the usual caveat, the opinions expressed by the participants do not necessarily represent the positions of their respective institutions. So this is our quick agenda. I'm going to give an initial case study to set the sort of tone for why we're discussing these matters. Michael is going to introduce the paper that all of us except Larry wrote on automation complacency, which is the impetus for our discussion. Emily is going to look at some of the concerns that lawyers and clinicians, including the clinicians that lawyers advise and represent, ought to have in mind as we wrap our minds and arms around the notion of complacency. Camille is going to look at some of the moral hazard and social aspects of this evolution in computing and human behavior technology. Yoel is going to look at sort of what the paths forward are and how we should address the challenges of these emerging technologies, specifically in healthcare. Larry is going to bring this all together and take us from the healthcare context into the broader environment of ethics around artificial intelligence and share with us some insights he's gained from editing a quite remarkable text, which we'll talk about later, that has 50 different chapters and 50 different perspectives on the ethics of AI, including, in full disclosure, a chapter that I wrote. And then we'll break into a panel discussion, which Larry will sort of lead and moderate and corral, about how we should be thinking about being hopeful but cautious about the influence of AI generally and in healthcare in particular. So this is our paper, Automation Complacency, Risks of Abdicating Medical Decision-Making, with Michael as our lead author. It was published in AI and Ethics, a journal, in full disclosure, that Larry is also the editor of, or co-editor of. And it is, of course, widely available because it is open access thanks to the financial sponsorship of Joel's academic institution. Thank you, Joel. We are here as a group, very much thanks to Ann Zimmerman and her Innovation Bioethics Forum, more information available at innovativebioethicsforum.com, which is an interesting combination of a study group and think tank. And you can get more information about what we do in that setting. And if you're interested, you can self-nominate for participation, which would be welcome, especially if you represent some perspective that is not currently among our ranks. The Innovation Forum has a website that you're welcome to visit and get an idea of what we have been doing, what the forum's mission is, and what kinds of work and publications have come out of the group in the past. Which leads us to the topic of tonight's discussion, the role of the law and ethics and lawyers and clinicians in dealing with this phenomenon of automation complacency. And in that regard, we should think about what are the rules, both legal and ethical and societal, that ought to guide our decision-making and our behavior in this area. Of course, we can't talk about patients and clinicians and medicine and rights without reflecting on the legal origin of thoughts about bioethics and patients' rights in general, and that is the articulation of Benjamin Cardozo in the case of Schloendorff versus the Society of New York Hospital, where Cardozo penned these resonant words: "Every human being of adult years and sound mind has a right to determine what shall be done with his own body." Unfortunate and imprecise gender selection, because Schloendorff was Mary Schloendorff, and the issue that was litigated in her lawsuit was the excision of a uterine fibroid. More on biology and anatomy later, but we want to think about this articulation from 1914 in the context of how it ought normatively to guide our behavior as we move into a realm of healthcare IT, utilizing automated algorithms in ways that are imaginable and some unimaginable, in a manner that's consistent with the notion that patients have the right to determine what shall be done to their own bodies. So I'm going to start us out with the presentation that got me thinking about all of these issues some time ago and really planted the thought in my mind that our paper ought not merely to rest in the world of academia, but ought to be presented and translated and made available to the clinical community as well. And this is regarding the use of artificial intelligence algorithms by payers. That's the term we use to describe insurance companies, in the post-discharge context of assignment of appropriate long-term care. And this notion was first brought to my attention by my friend and colleague Howard Finger and his colleagues. Howard is a gerontologist and clinical ethicist with the New York City Health and Hospitals Corporation, now known as Health Plus Hospitals. And he presented this notion at a conference on long-term care, the Post-Acute and Long-Term Care Medicine Association. And his premise was this: what could possibly go wrong when insurance companies, payers, utilize an AI algorithm to decide, based on the algorithm's review of the patient's medical record, where is an appropriate discharge plan? And what was interesting, just to cut to the chase, is that this was represented both by the creator of the algorithm and by the health insurance company that was using it, United Healthcare, and by the people who were operating it on behalf of United Healthcare as a decision support tool. More on that later. But what that means in this context is that there was a human being who was supposed to be reviewing the algorithm's determination, suggestion, instruction as to what would be an appropriate discharge plan for a particular patient. And sure, he probably did in some cursory way, but they fell into the same trap as the algorithm itself, which was not knowing what the algorithm couldn't know because it happened to have not been recorded in the patient's medical record. So what happened when this patient was ready for discharge from the hospital is the insurance company, United Healthcare, ran its algorithm and determined that it was both safe and appropriate for this patient to be discharged to their home, even though upon discharge, the patient had significant mobility issues and was confined to a wheelchair. What was so profound in Howard's presentation at the conference I attended was the single fact that the algorithm was not aware of, which is that the patient lived in a fifth-story walk-up apartment. And while sure, the ambulance crew could have carried the patient up the stairs 5 stories and gotten the patient into their apartment, the patient would have thereafter been completely imprisoned in said apartment without the ability to get themselves to doctor's appointments or to the supermarket or to other places outside their apartment. And this was quite an eye-opener for everyone at the conference, specifically with regard to the lack of insight that the algorithm and the physician who was supposed to be monitoring it had about what it didn't know. That is specifically the patient's living condition, which happened not to have been recorded in the medical record, probably because it didn't have any direct relevance to the patient's inpatient hospital care. So that's what set us up for our presentation tonight. And for those of you who are lawyers, let me share with you our first participation code. It is complacency. Write it down, commit it to memory, enter it as an email on your phone, whatever it takes to make sure that you remember it by the end of the program tonight. And with that, I'm going to turn the program over to Michael. Michael is a research scholar, part of the Innovative Bioethics Forum, and his areas of interest are, not surprisingly, the ethical impact of technology on the provision of healthcare. And Michael is going to talk about, well, Michael, why don't you start out talking about how you got the idea that this paper ought to be written in the first place?
Sure. Thank you so much, David, for the introduction. The paper kind of came to be, at least from my perspective. I'm sure every author has a very unique sense of this issue, and if that's reflected in their work, of course. My perspective was I started thinking a lot about descaling, which, of course, is a relatively recent phenomenon, but it's not necessarily unfamiliar to everybody. And what descaling might actually mean for both people in the workforce and outside of it. And what I mean outside of it is how we interact with our automation systems. So thinking about the dangers of dehumanizing and delocalized clinical care, the danger of losing respect for the sociocultural considerations that medicine brings often. It's an art after all. At least that's a point we like to make in our paper, is that these things are the perils, and of course there's promises, the large scale data calculus, um, the efficiency, that there is no doubt that there's plenty of promise, but we wanted to touch upon what actually makes the nuance in automation and provide a new opinion, or at least a one specific angle of that opinion, which is preserving the human aspect and remaining vigilant about the dangers of vigilance, the erosion of patient trust, and incomplete diagnoses, perhaps, as David mentioned in his example, or incomplete discharge planning. So that was kind of how it started. Of course, it morphed into putting some labels on the terms, automation bias and complacency, which we're going to introduce now. We have some, of course, some current and historical examples. That was a current example, but we've seen it historically about history repeating or rhyming and not wanting that to happen again. And acknowledging kind of how I alluded to about the paper's inception, the promises of automation and leveraging those promises and remaining vigilant on everything automation can do great, interchangeably AI, or maybe not interchangeably AI, but everything that these systems can do for us, these decision support systems. And then finally, some strategies forward. In other words, what can we actually implement in the real world for both psychologically, which we'll get into with the terms, but also institutionally. So with that, we can go ahead and dive in, and then we'll finish with some Q&A. We can go ahead and dive into the very first concept this paper introduces, which is automation bias. And there they are all outlined. Automation bias and automation complacency, which are psychological and then a behavioral response. Decision support and decision substitution, which occur at the clinician level in terms of what is being done or maybe what isn't being done. And finally, these in the context of the systems we're talking about or the systems we're not talking about, which we're calling decision support systems. So for the first slide on automation bias, go ahead and oh, this is I like to think about this example. So we often think that we may have a preconceived notion that tech is always right and we may be wrong. It looks official oftentimes, and we see these diagnoses, or they might be just at your computer, what you see on ChatGPT, and you're kind of questioning yourself, even though you might have studied, you might have experiences, you might have real world practices of what you've lived or embodied. But when you have this notion that tech is always right, you kind of start to second guess yourself. I thought this was a really funny example, and Camille also brought it up to our attention from The Office. It's just a TV show. You may or may not have seen it, but essentially, two characters are driving. One of them insists that the GPS needs to be followed, even though it's clearly heading straight into a lake. And he just keeps repeating himself, I have to go this way. This is what the GPS is saying. And of course, it leads him right into a lake, despite there obviously being no road in front of him. So I thought that was interesting. The idea of being so sure of our experiences or our real world practices, yet still second guessing ourselves because of this automation bias, this inclination, psychological pull to kind of defer to the AI. So we can go ahead and go to the next slide. And that is the first key term here, which really sets the stage for everything we talk about, which what automation bias is. It's the psychological inclination to defer to decision support tools. It's not a normative judgment. Perhaps it's a fundamental human tendency. So experts, novices, all experience levels are prone to automation bias. The bias makes us want to trust the output, take that mental shortcut. So that psychological pull is the first barrier we recognize when we're setting the stage for this ethical issue presented here. So the next term is automation complacency.
Sorry?
No worries. If the bias is the psychological pull, the automation complacency is the clinical trap because of that pull. It's essentially the why is it occurring, and what the how to mitigate it. So if automation bias is innate, how can we change our psychology to combat complacency, this action or lack of action to rely on a decision support system? Of course, automation complacency gets exacerbated by high stress situations. Of course, in the clinical space, those who are clinicians know this very well. There's issues of fatigue, understaffing, maybe competing priorities or budget limits. So your instinct might be to just defer to the output of an automation system you're interacting with. So if that's the bias, the complacency is the actual action of that deference or the lack of action and just relying on it to take the lead. So I hope that those kind of two terms make sense and help set the stage for the rest of this paper. So the next term I would like to introduce is decision support, which isn't so much of a term as it is a phenomenon happening. Clinicians using and complementing their expertise with decision support systems. How do we leverage automation to protect our cognitive resources without compromising our vigilance? Decision support is when complacency doesn't take the front seat, or you could say things are working properly in this context. And that is that embodied knowledge is being exercised, vigilance is remaining on high alert, and clinicians in this in this context, clinicians are using their expertise in conjunction with a tool or a decision support system to either issue a diagnosis, um, discharge a patient, for example. So decision support would be the good thing. However, when decision support gets sidelined, if we can go to the next slide, what you get is decision substitution. And that is the decision or the judgment is replaced to defer to decision support systems, kind of how I alluded to in the beginning, where you have the GPS example. That decision substitution took the front reins in that all expertise or knowledge were sidelined. And it can happen for a lot of reasons, like I said, high stress situations, but also with vendors providing technology that may be marketed as a support tool. And if a clinician relies on this tool, maybe without second guessing their output, it becomes substitution in practice, which is pushed by productivity targets. And it's even more exacerbated by the issue of adaptability versus transparency or explainability. As our automation systems are getting more and more complex, we begin to wonder, or even maybe just don't know how they're arriving at these decisions. And we demand more and more from our automated systems because they get better, they get smarter. We're not here to, fear monger automation. In fact, that the purpose of this paper is recognizing how great it can be in understanding what those guardrails can be to fully utilize it. So kind of with that being said, we can go ahead and go to the next slide. And I've talked a lot about decision support and the psychological pull, the behavioral outcome, how these are seen in practice from what a clinician is doing or maybe not doing, relying on technology or using their own expertise, but the actual systems in question could be a little vague, so we've defined them. And acknowledging, of course, all of these things are great. If you look on the three applications, imaging interpretation, clinical lab findings, and those sort of assessments and indications for further care and treatment, the clinical value is there, but the context in which they're being used is paramount. The human needs to remain in the loop. That's kind of a term we repeat in our paper of having a human in the loop while these decisions are being made. And to be there to make that final decision or oversee that final decision or understand why that final decision was being made. So here are some of the things we're talking about, and consequently, the things we're not talking about, which may be uh, pandemic modeling, perhaps it would be disease or drug discovery. Those aren't necessarily in question. It's more of the point of care technologies where the patient and the clinician interact in one way or another for some sort of point of care. So imaging interpretation, of course, has its applications and use cases of radiology and ultrasound. And the automation advantage there, or the distinction of how it can be used in an automated capacity, of course, is early disease detection, improved treatment planning, and overall being less invasive than the alternatives. But you run a risk of having a generalization or an overfitting of your data set as you seek to encompass a one-size-fits-all model. Assessments of clinical lab findings, blood chemistry tests, enzyme level tests, electrocardiogram tests have plenty of course, advantages. They assess probability of sudden death in a highly repeatable manner. But there may be an insufficient attention to the diagnostic accuracy because let's be honest, if a machine is working right 99% of the time, you're probably pretty happy with that. But when it doesn't, that 1% of the time, that can be really stressful for a patient, or the diagnostic outcome may just not be very clear for the patient. I've personally seen this firsthand of how this can be very stressful when you don't have a clinician to talk to right away, and what that might do to people, even just waiting an hour or two to talk to a doctor, the level of fear that could occur is it's really stressful and it's hard for families. So having someone there, a human in the loop at that point of care, I think is critical, and this paper kind of gets into that. And finally, indications for further care and treatment. Once again, we talked about this a bit in the example, but you have use cases such as speech therapy, physical therapy, discharge planning, and chatbots even more recently. I know that's come up a few different times in a number of ways, but they have their advantages. You can have incredibly efficient clinical care, a workflow, a clinical pipeline with that care coordination, and even possibly personalized communication. But with those automation advantages, you run the risk of potentially incorrect assumptions, what was not given to you about that patient, an incomplete case, or even sociocultural risks. Very simple things sometimes that have a way to get overlooked. Did that patient who you gave the report to or who the automated system gave a report to, do they have a medical literacy? Is English their first language? These sort of things come up, and having the advantages, of course, needs to just be assessed with the risks. It's such a paradox because the there's an endless amount of ways to utilize automation, and it really can we still don't know how much more it can go, but we know that the promise is huge. So it's just really about remaining vigilant on what those threats are and keeping a human element to our clinical care. Um, and more broadly, having a human element whenever you're interacting with an automated system. So yeah, that is kind of the framework for what we're talking about here.
Next.
That's it, and that would be good there.
Yeah. So when we started outlining this paper and started discussing how to convey to both clinical and academic audiences what was the nature of this challenge, I started thinking about historical analogs, and in particular, analog analogs, that is, non-computer based examples of, as I will present now, a technology in search of an application, which is very much what we're talking about when we talk about incorporating AI into healthcare. It's a new tool, a new toy, and it's a matter of finding where it can be useful. And this came up when radiation was first discovered as a diagnostic tool in the treatment of sudden infant death syndrome back in the 50s. X-ray had been discovered at the turn of the prior century, but hadn't really found a home until it became apparent that it could be used for imaging. And one of the ways in which imaging was utilized was diagnosing what was going on while avoiding what was common at the time, exploratory surgery. And then the technology took its next leap, going from a diagnostic tool to a therapeutic tool, something that could be used to treat disease. And in the treatment of sudden infant death syndrome, SIDS, one of the thoughts was that some of the children who died of SIDS at very early ages had what was viewed by the doctors who were doing the autopsies as enlarged thymus glands. And since they had already discovered that radiation could shrink swollen tissue, it wasn't an enormous clinical leap to conclude that the radiation therapy could be used to shrink the thymus gland and therefore prevent obstruction of the airway, the proximate cause of death in the case of SIDS. Here's what went terribly wrong and is the cautionary tale. The physicians of that era based their conclusion that these SIDS death incidents were tied to an enlarged thymus because they had learned in medical school what a normal thymus looked like, and they were smaller, and then therefore thought not to have as big a risk of causing airway obstruction. Problem was that they were not looking at normal thymuses in medical school, and they were not looking at pathologically enlarged thymuses in SIDS deaths. What they were looking at was the kind of babies that wound up on the anatomy lab table in medical school, typically children from poor backgrounds whose families couldn't afford burial, and therefore their bodies got donated to the medical school. And not surprisingly, children from impoverished backgrounds have often suffered from malnutrition. And that was ultimately found to be the reason why they had not normal thymus glands, but abnormally small thymus glands. And it was with that discovery that they realized that the radiation of the thymus glands of these infants was not doing any therapeutic good, and in fact was later discovered to create an entire generation of children who had thymus and related cancers, including breast cancer. And the same situation can be found in the evolution of the diagnosis and treatment of breast cancer, where radiation was at a time thought to be the definitive therapy, and now we know it is only one of 4 modalities that are available. So that was the historical and the non-computer generated antecedent that we used as our framing of our thoughts about automation complacency as a cautionary tale. And now we go to our legal scholar. Emily, walk us through the legal landscape for all of this automation complacency risk.
Thanks so
And
much.
just tell me when to advance the slides.
Will do. Thank you, David. I'm only going to touch on a few pieces of this because the regulatory landscape and the legal landscape here is quite huge. But I've picked a few cases that I think may interest you. Um, I hope it will interest the legal audience, and maybe those of you who are not lawyers will find something here too. But our first example comes from Texas and involves Pieces Technologies. In September of 2024, the Texas Consumer Protection Division of the Office of the Attorney General and Pieces entered into a voluntary compliance assurance after an investigation by the Consumer Protection Division. Pieces is an AI company that sells a product designed to integrate with the electronic health record. Their platform uses large language models and has several components. It creates a working summary, which is a brief narrative summary of a patient's hospital course. According to Pieces, the working summary, quote, distills the patient's current status into less than 100 words, covering the reason for admission, treatments, reasons for continued hospitalization, and upcoming events. The Pieces system monitors the electronic health record continuously for updates and rewrites the summary when it detects new material information, end quote. The platform also drafts daily progress notes for doctors, drafts discharge summaries, and performs discharge planning tasks like identifying and tracking discharge barriers. According to the voluntary compliance assurance, Pieces developed a series of metrics and benchmarks purporting to show that the outputs of its generative AI products were highly accurate. Many of their metrics incorporated the word hallucination, which is a term commonly used to describe the phenomenon of generative AI products creating an output that's incorrect or misleading. Specifically, Pieces advertised and marketed the accuracy of its products and services by claiming that they have a critical hallucination rate and severe hallucination rate of less than 0.001% and less than 1 per 100,000. Now, according to Texas, those representations may have violated the Texas Deceptive Trade Practices Act because they were false, misleading, or deceptive. In the assurance, Pieces denied any wrongdoing or liability, which is common, and it claims its representations were accurate. Nevertheless, Pieces agreed to several assurances for a period of 5 years. They agreed to make clear and conspicuous disclosures in their marketing and advertising. They agreed not to make any misrepresentations about their products, including statements about accuracy, reliability, efficacy, methodologies, et cetera, et cetera. And they agreed to make clear and conspicuous disclosures to customers about any known or reasonably knowable harmful or potentially harmful uses or misuses of their products. They also agreed to compliance monitoring, which amounts to giving them 30 days to provide information to Texas if they're asked for information related to their compliance with the assurance. So what do we make of this? Well, on the one hand, it's concerning that an AI company may have made misrepresentations to get hospitals to buy its AI platform. But the assurance has very little information about Texas's investigation or why it alleged those statements were misleading. If there was misconduct around Pieces' representations, then it's probably a good thing for them to be making some assurances. But when you look at the actual content of those assurances, it isn't clear that they agreed to do much more of anything but the bare minimum you would expect from an ethically minded healthcare company. So they agreed not to lie or mislead people about their products. They agreed to be clear about their metrics. They agreed to tell customers about any known problems. Yes, the compliance monitoring does add something, but even that's not particularly robust. They just agreed that if Texas asks for information related to the insurances, it will give them information within 30 days. The OAG already has broad investigative authority under the Deceptive Trade Practices Act, so it isn't clear exactly how much this adds. It's also interesting to note here that the press releases from the Texas OAG and pieces surrounding the assurances were very different. So the OAG's press release added additional allegations that weren't actually in the assurances. They claimed that at least 4 major Texas hospitals provided their patient information to pieces, and that the deceptive claims were likely inaccurate and may have deceived hospitals. They claimed that the deception put the public interest at risk, and it described the assurances in an interesting way. So it said that Pieces has also agreed to ensure that the hospital staff using its generative AI products to treat patients understand the extent to which they should or should not rely on its products. That sounds great, but I don't see that reflected in the assurances at all. So yes, Pieces has agreed to provide customers with understandable documentation about the nature and purposes of its generative output, but they have no obligation to make sure that all hospital staff actually read it or do understand it. And appropriate degree of reliance is kind of a tricky concept because it's one thing to inform someone about an error rate, and it's quite another to ensure that someone has such an understanding that they can perfectly calibrate their innate skepticism so that they rely on a program to a specific appropriate degree. Unsurprisingly, Pieces was clearly disappointed with the press release, and they kind of ironically claimed that it made misrepresentations. They pointed out the assurance makes no mention of safety and that there's no evidence of a public interest risk. And they claimed that they only entered into the agreement at all to demonstrate leadership, transparency, and collaboration. So we have some drama here between a tech company and the Texas OAG, and I really wish I knew what happened behind the scenes. Was it political or media posturing by the OAG, or was there a serious problem with Pieces? This case does show us that state governments and regulatory bodies are stepping into the conversation, and people are looking at AI systems in healthcare through a consumer protection lens. Transparency is clearly important, and no one would argue that we shouldn't push for accurate information. But it's worth noting that perfect transparency doesn't automatically translate into appropriate use. So Pieces said their error rate was less than 0.001%. What if it was actually twice that, or 10 times that, or 100 times that? What difference would that actually make to a user? Of course, we want accurate numbers, but when translated to practice, they can become almost meaningless. Those are all really, really tiny numbers. Humans are not machines that can deliberately calibrate their level of reliance to differences between error rates at this scale. And I think that's the big mistake that the OAG press release really makes. It directly implies that getting that correct error number is enough to ensure that people will appropriately rely or not rely on an AI product. It's such a vast oversimplification of what we're up against that I might argue it is itself misleading. We clearly need to do more here, as my colleagues will discuss later on. We can go to the next slide. So these are a whole bundle of cases actually involving insurers, and one of these is one of the ones David referenced at the beginning of this talk. I've lumped them together in the interest of time because they involve similar claims, but I'll get a little deeper here. So the Barrows plaintiffs are all insured under Humana's Medicare Advantage plan, and at some point they received post-acute care, which is medically necessary care for patients recovering from serious illness or injuries, and is something that their plan did cover. In these situations, we use a prospective payment system where they make coverage determinations before or during a patient's post-acute care. If an insurer decides to end coverage before the doctor's discharge date, the patient is forced to choose between foregoing necessary care or paying for it out of pocket. So the complaint alleged that Humana uses the NH-Predict artificial intelligence model to make these coverage decisions. The plaintiffs allege that instead of using human employees to make coverage decisions, Humana instead wrongfully delegates its obligation to evaluate and investigate claims to NH-Predict. Further, NH-Predict allegedly spits out generic recommendations based on incomplete and inadequate medical records and fails to adjust for a patient's individual circumstances and conflicts with the basic rules on what Medicare Advantage plans must cover. Plaintiffs also allege that Humana employees can't deviate from an NH-Predict decision, and those who do deviate are disciplined and terminated. Humana does not provide the reports to patients. Humana allegedly knows that NH-Predict is highly inaccurate, but they keep using it because they know that barely anyone, something like 0.2% of policyholders, will actually appeal a denied claim. The vast majority will either pay out-of-pocket costs or forgo the remainder of their prescribed post-acute care. According to the complaint, Humana banks on patients' impaired conditions, lack of knowledge, and lack of resources to appeal the wrongful AI-powered decisions. Deep breath. So in other words, the impassioned words of the complaint, the fraudulent scheme affords Humana a clear financial windfall in the form of policy premiums without having to pay for promised care, while the elderly are prematurely kicked out of care facilities nationwide, forced to deplete family savings to continue receiving necessary medical care, or forced to forgo care altogether, all because an AI model disagrees with their real live doctor's determinations. For those few patients that do appeal the denials, the plaintiffs allege a kind of horrible insurance revolving door. So patients can appeal their denials to a quality improvement organization, which is a third-party organization established to review claim determinations under the Medicare Act. But they claim that if people succeed on their QIO appeal, Humana will just request updated medical records, issue a new denial, and then force the patient to restart the appeals process again. If patients do end up appealing to an administrative law judge, Humana then just pays all the claims so that they can avoid any scrutiny of the NH-Predict model. So plaintiffs brought a suite of claims here. They included common law claims like breach of contract, breach of the implied covenant of good faith and fair dealing, unjust enrichment, and fraud. They also brought statutory claims under North Carolina in the Barrows case. The court heard a motion to dismiss over the summer, and in August, the court held that statutory claims were preempted by the Medicare Act, but it did allow the common law claims to proceed. I will note that Humana complained bitterly in their motion to dismiss that the complaint was sensationalized and copied from the Locken case, and the allegations in Locken are very similar. They involve the same AI model, and they claim that the model has a 90% error rate. There's also a motion to dismiss brought in Locken, and similar claims survived. Locken did address an additional issue in the motion to dismiss about exhausting administrative remedies. So usually in cases like this, the law requires a person fully exhaust their administrative remedies before going to court. In this case, someone could theoretically have appealed a claim all the way up to a final decision by the Medicare Appeals Council. These plaintiffs didn't do that, so UHC tried to get their case dismissed on those grounds. But the court found that the requirement was waived because plaintiffs suffered irreparable harm and because UHC's own behavior makes trying to exhaust administrative remedies futile. So first, UHC allegedly issues repeated denials anytime a patient is successful in appeal. So if a patient gets a denial overturned, they can expect another denial is around the corner. Second, for the very few appeals that do reach near the end of the appeals process, again, UHC just pays the claim. So they terminate the process there, making it virtually impossible for any claim to actually progress through the entire four-step appeal process and be ripe for judicial review. The Cigna cases also follow this general pattern, but they're not limited to post-acute care. And in these cases, plaintiffs argued that Cigna developed an algorithm known as PXDX, and it relies on this to enable its doctors to automatically deny payments in batches of hundreds or thousands at a time. So by relying on PXDX, allegedly, Cigna's doctors instantly reject claims on medical grounds without ever even opening patient files, leaving thousands of patients effectively without coverage and with unexpected bills. They claim that over a 2-month period, Cigna doctors denied over 300,000 requests for payment. They spent an average of 1.2 seconds on a claim before rejecting it. So both Cigna cases have had claims make it through a motion to dismiss, and the parties are now in discovery gearing up for class certification. To center this around a specific human, because our group kind of hopes to center most discussions around actual humans, I'll quickly tell you the story of one of the plaintiffs in the Locken case. So Mrs. Buckner was hospitalized for a heart attack, and then had a triple bypass. About a week later, she was discharged to go to rehab or a skilled nursing facility, but UHC denied her, so she had to forego care or go home. She ended up going home, and a hospital caseworker appealed the decision, and UHC flipped, of course they did, and they granted coverage. But because she was already back home, she needed an additional referral from her primary care physician to get back into skilled nursing. And this whole process delayed her return to care. Her condition deteriorated, and she started experiencing complications. But she got back into skilled care, and it ended up she was so ill that after a few days, she was sent back to the hospital for acute inpatient care. And I'm sure you can guess what happened next. UHC again decided to stop paying, and they denied any further coverage. So her surgeon refused to clear her for discharge because she had an open infected wound from the heart surgery. She was on blood thinners, and she was receiving IV antibiotics. At the time of suit, Miss Buckner had an outstanding bill of $67,000. So obviously awful for Mrs. Buckner and others. But how does this relate to automation complacency? Well, we wanted to bring it up for a few reasons. While these AI systems are being used by insurers to deny claims, they're being used to determine what services are medically necessary. They're algorithms that are trying to do certain tasks based on medical record review. A system that can read the HR to figure out if someone's likely to have complications is the same type of system that can read them to decide what care someone might deem appropriate. So we might think we're developing AI systems to improve patient outcomes, but we have to be aware that that same tech is going to bleed over and be used by other entities who may have different goals. Also, in the US, insurers have a huge impact on how and what care is delivered. So even though this isn't really an automation complacency problem, I think the AI systems here are actually doing exactly what the insurers intended them to do. It's worth bringing up how insurers are using AI too, and they're really dedicated to continuing to use AI tools. These claim denials are just one example. We should keep an eye on these cases and on insurer behavior. Some of these claims may hinge on a single sentence in an insurance policy saying, for example, that medical necessity determinations need to be made by a medical director, i.e., not an algorithm. We'll keep watching and see what happens in the space. One interesting thing to report is that people are now designing AI tools to fight the insurers' AIs. So that's kind of fun. People are getting very angry here. We know they're getting angry with insurers. We see that in these lawsuits. We see people fighting back with AI tools. We've seen it on the streets of New York City. And lastly, while these particular systems are used by insurers, it's easy to imagine an AI discharge planning tool used by a hospital missing the mark. And this is an example that we used in our paper. So and David referenced it at the beginning as well, the algorithm might not have access to all relevant information. It might not know whether a patient lives in a walk-up apartment, for example. So it could issue a recommendation that a patient's safe to discharge home because they're able to walk on level surfaces. But a human being would immediately notice the problem. This patient can't go safely home because they can't safely get into their home. All right, one more legal case. We'll go to the next slide, and then we'll go back to ethics. So this is about a company called Practice Fusion. And in 2020, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Vermont got a company called Practice Fusion to execute a deferred prosecution agreement. This was the first ever criminal action against an electronic health record vendor. Practice Fusion admitted that it solicited and received kickbacks from a major opioid company in exchange for utilizing its electronic health record software to influence physician prescribing of opioid pain medications. So specifically, in exchange for a, quote, sponsorship payment from a pharmaceutical company, Practice Fusion allowed the company to influence the development and implementation of clinical decision support alerts to increase the sales of their products. Practice Fusion permitted pharmaceutical companies to participate in designing the clinical decision support alert, including selecting the guidelines used to develop the alert and setting the criteria that would determine when a healthcare provider actually received the alert. And in some cases, they even drafted the language of the alert itself. Criminal fines and forfeiture amounted to over $26 million. There were also separate civil settlements. Practice Fusion here agreed to pay about $118.6 million. The $1 million kickback in the criminal case came from Purdue Pharma that was released later. And in the civil settlement, there were 13 other arrangements where Practice Fusion agreed with pharmaceutical companies to implement clinical decision support alerts intended to increase the sales of their products. The conduct here is pretty abhorrent. If you're interested, you can read the information and statement of facts. There were communications, for example, showing that they were doing things like specifically targeting patients who had never taken opioids before. The time period at issue here was 2014 to 2019, and you may have noticed that I haven't mentioned AI. This is not an AI case, so why did I include it? Well, I admit I sometimes like splashy examples of AI gone wrong, because seeing AI fail spectacularly can be entertaining, and it also has a lot of rhetorical potential. A big, obvious error is great to show people why we should be careful. But the Practice Fusion case shows us that we need to worry about more subtle influences too. It shows that these decision support systems have the power to subtly shift the practice of medicine. They can create these non-obvious shifts where output looks reasonable at an individual level, but can create change in the aggregate that was not intended by the clinician user. I am sure in the Practice Fusion case that there were times when a clinician ignored the prompt to prescribe an opiate because they judged it inappropriate. I'm sure that the opiate suggestion was not always wrong, and sometimes when a clinician did accept it, it may very well have been within reasonable medical judgment to do so. But that was the beauty of the scheme. It went on for years without notice, and it worked. Providers who got the alerts prescribed at higher rates than those who didn't, and that amounted to tens of thousands of additional prescriptions. It is inevitable that the use of AI systems will create shifts, intended or not, in how we practice medicine. We need to be vigilant here so we can notice when these shifts are happening, and we need mechanisms to help us evaluate what to do about it. Practice Fusion also shows us that not all actors in this space have good intentions. We cannot assume that AI decision support developers and sellers share our goals. By accepting these AI tools into the clinical care setting, we're giving them some degree of power over how healthcare is delivered and over our own well-being. Some companies might have noble aims, but some do not. So on that note, we'll go back to the ethics. We'll do the next slide, please. And this is one of the points that we made in our paper, that personalized and holistic care really does require a person who cares. So we kind of took as a working assumption that general clinical care should be organized to optimize patient outcomes with precise and effective treatments by meeting individual medical needs. So the use of decision support systems, like most aspects of clinical care, should maximize clinical value from resources. While things like an accurate diagnosis or choosing the right medication are good goals for any clinician, there's many other factors contributing to patient well-being. Things like patient preferences, relevant and effective communication, and the general emotional empathy of clinicians can all contribute to successful clinical care. An automated system's output, like an accurate diagnosis, is therefore only addressing one part of the patient's well-being. Michael mentioned the term human in the loop before, and we assert that keeping a human in the loop at all decision stages of clinical care is critical to combating automation complacency. It can ensure personal sensitivities are accounted for and that patient preferences are met. Clinicians' expertise is steeped in experience and may be nearly irreplaceable for appropriately including idiosyncratic human factors in medical decision-making. An automated system could successfully generate something like a patient preference profile of some sort, but that's still worlds apart from meaningfully conversing with a patient or having a conversation that informs care. So a patient who is, for example, diagnosed according to an automated system's diagnostic recommendations might disagree with the suggested treatment plan despite its accuracy or statistical merits. Maybe the patient's quality of life would be reduced if a rigorous treatment plan were chosen to aggressively treat a disease. And while an automated system could argue or compute that a certain treatment plan is necessary due to its survival calculus, the patient might disagree if their personal calculus differs, which might be a combination of morals, pain preferences, and external factors. More importantly, only a person can properly assess their own needs as they're experiencing pain or discomfort in the face of sickness. Patients need to be the primary voice in their treatment plan. And if we lose the clinician as a listener and a conversation partner, we risk losing things of real value, like personalized treatment and the opportunity for relationship building. Both algorithm-driven decision-making and digitalized therapeutic interactions can remove the human touch from healthcare. And this brings us now to our next concern, which is the risks of the patient-clinician relationship on the next slide. So we know from research here that positive patient-clinician relationships are associated with better outcomes. There's a bunch of studies on this. So for example, in one study, patients with chronic conditions found that participants who reported better quality patient-provider relationships also perceived less treatment and self-management burden. They reported less distress, and they felt greater confidence in their ability to self-manage. Another study found that the primary factor influencing whether a cancer patient decides to report medication management concerns and safety events is their perceived relationship with their clinicians. Mutual regard and trust are key components of good relationships, and this relationship is particularly important in psychotherapy. In this context, research demonstrates that after accounting for patient characteristics, the therapeutic relationship between a patient and provider can actually account for as much and probably more of the outcome variance between patients as particular treatment methods. Next slide, please. So we argued that the potential impacts of decision support systems on the patient-clinician relationship have to be evaluated. If clinicians rely inappropriately on decision support systems, this could have negative impacts on the relationship. For instance, a clinician who adopts a suggested diagnosis without critical analysis might be unable to satisfactorily explain to the patient why that diagnosis is appropriate. If, like in our inappropriate patient discharge example, a clinician signs off on an inappropriate discharge by recklessly adhering to the recommendation of an algorithm, this could undercut the patient's trust and respect for their clinician. Similarly, a clinician who adopts a suggested course of treatment without considering alternatives might be unprepared to discuss treatment options with the patient, and they might not be able to tailor the treatment to the patient's particular concerns. All of these examples could be avoided if clinicians appropriately use these systems for decision support rather than decision making. Learning the extent to which these problems may occur requires evaluation of the tool in the clinical environment itself. We also want to acknowledge that patient perceptions in AI healthcare absolutely vary, but they're important. So some people may trust ChatGPT more than their doctor, but many patients are uncomfortable with the use of AI in their healthcare, and they don't believe it will lead to better health outcomes. There's some data on this as well. To the extent that the use of AI systems is disclosed to a patient, as they often should be, the patient might respond according to their perception of AI. So a patient's distrust of AI could translate to less trust in the clinician, damaging that relationship and potentially lowering the patient's confidence in their quality of care. Patient safety and benefit simply cannot be adequately assured by evaluating AI performance outside of the clinical setting. We must also evaluate the clinician-AI interaction and the resulting clinician-patient interaction. If we don't, our evaluations won't capture indirect impacts like impacts on the patient-clinician relationship. And with that, I'm going to take a deep breath and turn this over to Camille, I think.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Emily.
Emily. And Camille, take us through how this affects our culture and how our culture affects our acceptance of automation. Please.
Thanks, Dave, and thanks, Emily, for leading us into this seamless thinking about how the patient-doctor relationship is impacted by these technologies, but also how the patient-doctor relationship looks different in different contexts and cultures, right? So that got me thinking, are there universal values that the world, the globally can agree on, that we could actually incorporate in the decision support tool, tech development? Now, that seems highly unlikely. I think most of us would agree that we would be able to agree on a set of values, but who knows? That we could always hope for something like that. So here's a table of how AI could be contextualized. So for example, I am from South Africa, and you may have heard about the concept of Ubuntu. So Ubuntu is a way of looking at the world, and it's a saying, it says Umuntu, Ngubuntu, Ngubantu, which means I am because we are. So this, we can see that some cultures in South Africa prioritize a much more holistic and relational approach to most of their whole being, but also then it infiltrates into their healthcare. So that could be incorporated into the AI support decision tool. And you could make it more about shared decision making. But how would this even be possible if we think of the South African context where there are 11 official languages? It's very diverse, and would we be able to incorporate and do justice to all different linguistic and cultural aspects of such a rich society? So there's also been, and then additionally, there's been a lot of critique about the concept of Ubuntu because this could also just lead to very superficial and tokenistic use of the concept of Ubuntu without actually engaging or enabling the user to engage with such a concept in a more deeper and meaningful way, which it really is. So the second example that I wanted to use was of West Africa. And for them, oral traditions, or for some of the cultures there, again, that's such a generalization. But some of those cultures actually really value oral traditions still to this current day. And that could mean that the AI model could give more narrative answers and not just give like bullet points. But this could also lead to romanticizing the whole idea of just certain stereotypes, and that could also enforce certain just generalizations. And of course, then I think something that we should be aware of also is the use of the language that these models use and how they've been trained, because the data could be more from a colonization point of view, and that could cause the AI to use not language that's not decolonized. And that could also bypass local epistemic authority of the elders or the healers in the society. And then the last example that I wanted to use was Japan, and they prioritize high context communication. So AI could use more harmonious language, but this could also lead to reinforcing social pressure not to disclose suffering, and it could also lead to people not getting the help that they need when they need it in situations, because the model was, programmed and trained in a certain way. Next slide, Pete, please. So that being said, Michael alluded to the promises that abound for decision support tools, and I'm going to take us through a whirlwind of those promises, and then we're going to move towards the perils as well. So obviously these tech tools could reduce our workload, like that picture on the screen with the forklift. It could be a very useful tool to optimize our cognitive resources. I don't know, I think of the example as well of Alfred Marshall, who was the father and founder of capitalism. And he actually wrote another smaller book before he wrote the elements of economics, called The Pure Theory of Domestic Values. And in that book, he said that if we would get to a point where, capitalism was doing what it does best, we could even have more time for reading poetry, and less time fighting wars, which I think, yeah, that sounds great. But again, how realistic is that? Do we even want to read poetry still today? Yeah. So again, another promise could be that there could be early detection of diagnoses, or deterioration of a patient, because we could be continuously monitoring their heart rate, the vital signs. We could predict sepsis 4 to 6 hours before there were any traditional clinical signs appearing. We could detect postpartum hemorrhage risk early, and we could also have autonomous alerts during anesthesia. Then, of course, one that is very important for my context is expanding access to lower resource settings. So this could be an absolute game changer for countries who many of the population do not have access to healthcare. So you could put the patient in contact with scarce specialists through telemedicine, through these decision support tools, because there were certain barriers, such as the transport is expensive for them, for certain groups to get to the clinic or to the hospital. And then, of course, lastly, there could be a lot of personalized, very trendy support for preventative medical decisions, which could, of course, also change a lot of public health systems and how resources are spent. Next slide, please. So these promises really are conditional, and I think that's something that we really highlighted in our paper. Like this picture, I see it's portraying a bit incorrectly, but anyways, with the different colors of the hands, it depends on the diversity and the representativeness of the data, and I think we already had Craig, I think in the Q&A, who said that the AI models need to be trained better. So again, these promises are conditional about being ethical and transparent model design, but as Emily also said, transparent does not always mean that they're actually doing what they should be doing. And then respect, but also accounting for cultural diversity and linguistic differences. And it's more than just respect, it's accounting for that as well, and equally weighing the diversity. Then local development of decision support tools, a human in the loop, we've also mentioned that. Robust regulatory frameworks that Emily also took us through. And then, of course, this paper's aim was really to also educate and make people conscious of automation complacency in the age of AI. Thank you.
Thank you, Camille. And now we go to, now we go to Yoel to talk to us about how this can all work out fine. So, Yoel, it falls to you to reassure us that we're not doomed and that some good will come of this if we can just survive the transition process. Quick note, questions in the Q&A box we will definitely get to during our panel discussion at the end after Yoel and Larry. And so if you have more questions, please put them in the Q&A box. And Yoel, over to you.
Thank you, David. Can you go one slide back? I think you skipped one.
Oh, sorry.
There we are. Thank you. From promises, conditional promises, it's nice to move back to perils and then consider mitigation and mindful integration. And lastly, I'm going to position our work, our research into the kind of greater context of research about algorithms and AI and the roadmap of research by the Nuffield Council of Bioethics. So perils go beyond treatment outcomes and health outcomes, as some of these, maybe all of these have already been mentioned. The perils include deterioration of trust, not just in the clinician, but in the maybe health system more broadly. And then alterations to the clinician-patient relationship, not maybe all bad, but clearly some alterations to the things that, like the relationship dynamics that have been like the standard so far. And then the concerns about delocalizing, dehumanizing care, meaning that if it would be like efficiency-wise feasible to kind of model like pathways, clinical pathways with different algorithms, like bringing that sort of model to some specific local sociocultural context might be pretty tricky. So kind of you would need to know the local landscape to integrate something like that without making the care feel delocalized or even dehumanized. And of course, like the human element in healthcare, like Michael mentioned at the beginning, the art of medicine, not just like a production line mentality, but actually like those embodied human expertise that are part of the care professions. And that kind of links to the next one of the skilling the workforce, and maybe the emphasis being in that embodied, hard to articulate expertise that will all be like acquired throughout one's career and those encounters with patients and families. And of course, accountability and more narrowly like legal liability, like those sort of perils and issues. And the mitigation side, like a couple of the broader themes that have been also in part mentioned, like maintaining, allocating vigilance, like that high index of suspicion, that cognitively demanding, being very alert about potential mistakes. We need to maintain that when it's needed, and we need to allocate those like limited cognitive resources to the points of care or points of the decision-making process that actually like critically need them. And also it's very good to realize that those mental resources are limited, and if we gain much more like, let's say, free cognitive capital or like free or comparatively pretty cheap information processing capabilities from the AI, it would be a really awful outcome that those resources would actually create worse outcomes or worse create these clinical perils, because the promises, as mentioned very many times already, really huge if those can be mindfully integrated. And human in the loop, in which loops, in which parts of the loops, which parts of the decision-making process, which are the critical decision points that should never be offloaded to AI, what are the interactions needing those embodied human expertise that AI at least struggles to mimic in the foreseeable future. And then the idea of reskilling clinicians for AI integration, kind of learning those skills, how to interact with AI, how to let AI be the complementary tool that advances the provision of care, and reinvesting those saved resources. If some tasks can be offloaded to AI, then human resources should be focused on the tasks that only should be provided by humans. And next we go to the mindful integration, like the spectrum of it, and then to more specific and even technical points of design. So next slide, please.
Oops, sorry.
Yeah, in the work we had this figure of a spectrum of task-specific appropriateness or like mindful integration of AI. On the one side, you have like very much like a task ready for automation, task that maybe should be even like there is an ethical justification for automating them to spare the limited cognitive resources. And on the other hand, you have the human tasks that always deserve a human in the loop with lots of personal and contextual subtleties. And then kind of the spectrum of between those two. So maybe at some point it's okay to use AI only for like monitoring the decisions done by humans and then giving feedback or flagging mistakes afterwards. And or maybe at some point of the spectrum there is good to retain the decision-making process itself on the human professional, but maybe adding to it, like complementing it with synthesizing summaries or providing different information that the physician might be lacking while making this decision, or just maybe retaining the final interpretation, having this like differential diagnosis, maybe different prediction models that can give like different inputs for the human professional, and maybe just leaving the final interpretation to the human clinician. So there might be the spectrum of some tasks might be on like different points of the spectrum. And on the other hand, we have the benefit of sparing cognitive resources, which is also a very real benefit and should be considered, and not just thinking that every task needs the full high index of suspicion and full human vigilance. And other side, of course, tasks that always deserve human in the loop and should remain the highest of vigilance possible. Yeah, next one, please. And then a little bit about like potential decision choices. And many of these were like are synthesized from the broader literature that we went through during the research for the article. One big one, of course, very much on or like common knowledge is the explainability one. So showing clinically relevant explanations on how the model arrived to the decision, not just like for legal reasons having some explanation, but actually like understandable, kind of going through the reasoning process that the model used to arrive to the recommendation or yeah. And then the idea of critical decision points, those points that like should have an explicit clinical confirmation, not just kind of going through the loop, but like those points of the loop or the workflow that always needs like human to sign off. And maybe like one approach would be a configurable confidence thresholds. So when the model perceives its confidence to lack or like drop below a specific like threshold, maybe then it should hand off the process to human professional again. So maybe that sort of approach would work for some tasks in that spectrum, the so-called graded approach. Or only like decision monitoring. This was maybe the original recommendation from the earliest article about this topic, that maybe, yeah, it shouldn't be even decision support, but it should just be monitoring and then flagging mistakes, highlighting anomalies, and surfacing counter evidence when needed. And then the idea of the differential diagnosis, different tools working in interaction with human professionals, maybe with teams. So kind of providing different like approaches or ways to go about it, or like approach the treatment decision or some other decision, like having that sort of engaging interaction, not just like passive following of the recommendations. And of course, access to source data. And so there should be always like an easy way to access the source data. And one other like additional point on the right side of the screen about the user interface, like interface facing the physician or the patient in some cases, but like concerning our work, mainly the physician, clinician, like on-screen detail. If it's difficult to use, many studies show that like the cognitive strain just goes up, and people are more and more susceptible for the automation bias or complacency to take hold. Like falling into the complacency trap is much easier when the tool itself is frustrating, or like you need to switch before platforms constantly. So those sort of like technical designs are very interesting and like critical when we are trying to avoid the trap of complacency. And maybe it shouldn't just be an interaction between the system and one clinician. Maybe it should be like a team effort and like combination of all those different design attributes, and like how to actually organize the workflow appropriately for the given context. It might look very different in different contexts, but these are kind of like the elements that one can use to configure like the optimal, try to best like try to reach the most mindful way to integrate the new technology. And maybe the last option should be friction, because then you kind of lose the efficiency gains. So, but that's still better than the complacency trap in our mind, at least. So those are like the technical choices that came up from the previous literature and from the synthesis. And next one. So a positioning of our work into the broader kind of research context, the Nuffield Council roadmap for research, especially for like about social and ethical implications of algorithms, data, AI, it kind of had these 3 tasks that I think our effort kind of contributes to the first 2 at least. So kind of concept building, having like clear distinctions when trying to do this ethical research about like the impacts, sociocultural impacts of new technology, especially AI in this case, kind of having those distinctions between decision support, decision substitution, automation bias, automation complacency makes the future work, like ethical work and deliberation, more easy when we have these like understandings, shared understandings of what we are talking about when we are talking about the perils of automation by like decision support systems. And the other one, exploring and addressing different tensions. And the report from Nuffield kind of highlighted many different potential trade-offs when it comes to integrating AI, and I added a few of them, maybe the most like key ones for this context: accuracy versus explainability and fairness, quality and transparency of services versus privacy and informational autonomy. When there's more like higher data demands, then the like issues of privacy and informational autonomy always surface. And then efficacy versus safety and sustainability, and maybe for our like not just health related outcomes, but like the broader social cultural outcomes, the convenience versus self-actualization and dignity. And our addition would be, and we recommended in the article, only also consider like the changes and alterations to different relationships and human interactions, and the connection and therapeutic alliance that like reliant on these tools that increase convenience, but might have significant changes to the like clinical care relationships or therapeutic alliances. And of course, task 3, still like lots of work to do. Different design choices need to be tested, and evidence base needs to be gathered to like try to resolve these trade-offs in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joel. You left me slightly optimistic, and I appreciate that there are changes that can be made that will get us to a better place. I have to say, the questions that we've gotten in the Q&A box are very much suggestive of the notion that we can get to a place where these systems work. The question is, how much time will it take for us to get there? And I don't think anyone knows the answer to that question just yet, but at least we have raised the flag, and we'll get to those questions in just a moment. So let me reset my slides here, and we move on to Larry Metzger. Larry is a research professor at the University of Vermont, not an author on our paper, but he was the editor or co-editor of the journal in which it was published. And Larry comes at these questions with a completely different perspective from the rest of us, because he is a technologist. He is actually in the computer science weeds and thinking about ethics from that perspective. So Larry, I turn to you now to share the insights that you gained through editing your forthcoming Handbook of AI and Ethics. We interrupt this introduction for a commercial message. Here it is. This book is remarkable, and I say that again, not because Larry asked me to contribute a chapter, but because it brings together 50 different perspectives on AI across the spectrum. There are only a couple of chapters that I recall seeing that even touch on healthcare issues. It touches on everything. So Larry, take us through where our concerns about complacency in healthcare, with all of its immediacy and sort of unmitigatable potential harm in other disciplines. What did you learn from editing this book?
Well, thanks, David. And I have learned things from this. And one of them is that there are people like yourself who are eager to address these issues that in a way that the professionals in all fields can understand. And I think that's really important. We've got plenty of articles about the technology and fluff about AI that may or may not be accurate. But I felt we needed something that professionals in all different fields could see how AI might impact them, have some amount of high-level technology discussion, but mainly just focus on cases about what could go wrong, what could be good too. And so we're very excited about this coming out and seeing if we can actually help people in the places where AI is going to impact in society. I thought before we come to the panel, which I think is going to be really interesting to talk about these things, I would just do a slight history here of the technology and the law too, because it's kind of interesting. I also started a data science program at George Washington University, and I was always interested how students coming into the program in 2016 really thought AI had started about a couple of years ago. But there's a whole history and things that we've learned actually that we should probably pay attention to. So I thought I'd just say a few words. Some of you, I mean, many of you may know, and some may not, that AI as a research area started about 70 years ago, not 2 years ago, but 70. And the dangers that we're talking about today, I was just and challenges. I was just thinking how we were aware of those 50 years ago, and we've had that much time to get it right, but we're still working on it. So when you say how long till we have systems that are where people are speculating they'll be, well, it might be 50 more years. But anyway, so the one thing I'd like to say about the technology part is that data is so important. It's really the central thing. And that's where a lot of problems come in as well. Data governance, privacy, and issues we've already heard about, but we'll hear more about. So the thing about AI, it's in its nature that we have to have data, and lots of it, and high quality data. That's another thing about my data science students that I always found interesting, that they were more interested in running some software on data than to make sure the data was worth running something on. But it's a problem it's rampant today, that people don't pay enough attention to the quality of the data. Is it relevant to the task that you're trying to work on? And cleaning the data and making sure that that's part of the quality of the data. And then the other thing about decision support, decision support systems were, people did a lot of work on that in the 1980s. There was something called expert systems. It's part of AI. A lot of those had to do with medical problems or issues. And the idea was to take a fairly narrow area and have a logic tree that could help diagnose a person's, from a person's symptoms. And so the idea was to search for experts who would be willing to share how is it they are so good at diagnosing things. And so with decision support systems and expert systems and things like that, there was these two sort of aspects that needed to be thought about and worried about. Some things are a matter of logic, and there's based on you can make suggestions with certainty, but others you can only work with probabilities. You don't have data that can just tell you the answer to a problem, and so that's a distinction I think people need to think about too. So anyway, so the importance of data, I'm saying it again because I'll hopefully say it a few more times as well. It's just so important. And that's one thing that I think that's part of the ethical consideration is, are people using correct data? Sometimes they might use data that's actually intentionally misleading. We know about that. But even with the best of intentions, is the quality good? Because the system just depends on the outcome, depends on the high quality of data. Now, as far as risks and issues of ethics and law, problems then are once you have data for the AI system, how do you protect that data? How do you provide privacy to people that the data is about? How do you prevent unauthorized access, secondary use of the data? These are all issues that we know about today, but they've been studied and discussed for, like I said, about 50 years for other AI systems. But also not the you talked about, is there any reason for hope? Of course, there's a lot of societal benefits, and we're talking about the potential harm just so that we can minimize that and focus on the benefits. So I think one of the questions I'd like to hear people talk about later on is how should these dynamic data-intensive AI systems that learn over time, how can they be regulated without stifling the decision-making of humans, and specifically clinicians and doctors, and realizing that the data that's involved in decision support is dynamic. It's getting new data all the time, and so that the AI system can improve. We say it learns, but that's just because we're humans and we know what learning is. So, and then I'll mention human in the loop again, just to end my little spiel right now. But we also talk about human AI collaboration and mindful integration of humans with AI systems. And personally, I think that's the way it needs to be. Some of us in my school of thought don't like to talk about automated systems. We don't think they should ever be completely automated, and that humans have a permanent place, and that the human judgment and considerations should complement the automation. Well, there I used the word, but the tool, but not replace the humans. And in my technical field, we have a whole school of thought about human-centered design and human-centered AI. That's a very active, growing field of how do we intentionally design systems with the human in mind. So that was just some thoughts that a lot of these I thought of hearing the other presentations, and I thought it might help put things in perspective.
Very much so. Larry, before we jump into our panel discussion, which I'm also very much looking forward to, you focus on making sure we have quality data. And the thing that I'm concerned about in that narrow regard is how do we assess and judge and label the quality of data if generative AI systems are continually pulling in new sources to educate themselves. And I'm thinking here about the settlement that was just announced, where a major AI company that will remain nameless, not to protect the innocent, was siphoning in the literary works of authors to educate its AI system, having no particular idea of the quality of that literature as a source of information for an algorithm. Are there any hopeful tools on the horizon that will enable us to track what a generative AI system is being trained on at the speed of light? What are your thoughts?
I don't think so. And that's, I would say that the generative AI, well, no, I'm not a pessimist, but I don't think that we'll be able to figure that one out. It's just that it's sort of the current prime example of why data is so important. And it takes data from, everywhere it can find, and some of it's contradictory data. And so it uses that to give a response, and, you could get a different response if you ask the question differently sometimes. So I think that's just a huge problem with LLMs, that the data isn't reliable, and we're using it anyway to make decisions. Now, one way to address that is to have not this huge database that's going to be able to answer every question a person could have, but have smaller databases, and some companies are doing that now. A database that they can make sure the quality is good and that it's relevant to what they're using it for. And I think that's a better approach. So it's sort of distributed databases that don't all try to answer every question that could be asked, but focuses on an area. It kind of reminiscent of expert systems, because that's the only way they work, is if you could narrow it down to a fairly small area. And it's been the struggle in AI forever, trying to build a general purpose AI system, but realizing it's probably impossible. And so you break it up into parts and that you can actually address successfully.
Well, I'm sure we'll get to artificial general intelligence when we dive into our discussion. So let's move there now. And I will have the final participation code for the lawyers in the audience after our panel discussion. But Larry, as I think about all that we've discussed tonight, and thank you to all of my friends, colleagues, co-authors for excellent presentations. And as we think about all of the growth of AI that we can anticipate and how a notion and a sensitivity to automation complacency can be a cardinal warning or sentinel alert, I keep thinking about the frog in the pot of water, right? If you throw a frog into a pot of water that's boiling, it will jump out. If you put the frog in cool water and slowly heat it, at least some of the frogs are going to wind up getting overwhelmed by the heat before they realize that the hot water is the problem. And with that in mind, can you take us through a discussion of what ethical issues come to mind in other fields that we in healthcare should be aware of in order to avoid becoming the frog in the pot of slowly heating water?
Okay.
Take us down that road.
Yeah, great. In addition to looking at the handbook when it comes out, right?
Yes.
So yeah, I thought maybe it'd be helpful to think about sort of different lenses for thinking about the ethics of other things as well, but especially in healthcare. And I have picked out three things. So they have names that I'm going to not use much, but one would be consequentialism. It's basically outcomes. What's the outcome of using the technology? So we could judge AI ethically by its real world impacts on patients, on clinicians, on communities. Now, these three aren't, we don't have to choose one and say that's our ethical stance, but, they give different perspectives. And so that one might be more important than another. And the other one is the deontology rules. What's our duty? We're in a professional society. We have a set of rules we're supposed to follow. If we don't follow those rules, we could say that was unethical, within the profession we're in. And the third one would be virtue ethics. So how do we want to see ourselves, as users of AI and participating in organizations that use AI? So anyway, I thought maybe I could bring those up when I think they're necessary to or interesting to on different issues that we talk about. So what are the outcomes of using AI in a task or an organization? By being in that organization, do we have some rules that we should really follow? And then also to encourage a practice of using automation that complements what we do and doesn't just replace what our moral issues that we're concerned about.
Yeah, and let me add that I think that framing really brings to our discussion the issue raised by Craig in the question and answer box. He says it sounds like the AI just needs to be trained better, and the trainers need to be better. Which kind of better is, of course, interesting, technical, moral, or communication-wise, to ensure that they are including more and the correct information in their LLMs. And then Craig wisely follows up with a second entry. Granted, AI is not there yet to be released on its own, but someday. So friends, do we think it's possible to train AI according to any of the three philosophical models that Larry outlined, so that it gets it right at some point in the future, putting aside the fact, obviously, that AI is already popping up everywhere. We'll get to that question in a moment. But take Larry's framing, and where should we go with that? I'm looking at you, Camille.
I can dive in, sure. Yeah, I think that's really valuable to just go, I don't want to say back to basics, but the philosophical moral underpinnings of ethics and see how we can apply those to the AI models that we build. My first reaction would be that that could work in some contexts, but also again not in all contexts. And I was even thinking maybe you could have like a mode that you could choose when you're using these tools. So you could say, can you approach this using this framework or something? That might be an option. But yeah, that's just me spitballing ideas.
All right, who else? Anyone want to take up Kantian rules? Joel, go for it. Yoel.
Well, I'm not sure about the country and rules, but I was thinking just like regarding the decision tool design, like in some tasks, like just normal utilitarian calculus would maybe be very sufficient, like just trying to maximize the health outcome or some other outcome. But in other ones, like if there would be like this hard collision to some principle or duty, then there might be some sort of like a critical decision point that should maybe offload like offhand the task to human professional. So maybe those sort of like deontological considerations or like thresholds could be designed into the system to kind of hand off to human at that point.
Begging the question, will the humans take the time to scrutinize each of the AI outputs as they spit out at the speed of light, a point that, Emily, you touched upon in your legal review? Is there a way of enforcing the humans actually being in the loop and not just being on the side of the loop? What do you think?
I think a big problem sort of generally in healthcare is who has power to control how the patient interaction goes and how providing care goes, and what are their incentives. When I picture an ideal version of what a doctor or a nurse or any clinician working with AI looks like, it is someone who is using a tool not because it's there or because their hospital manager tells them they need to use it, or because they can't get away from it because it's built into the EHR, but because it's really the right thing for that job, and it frees them up to do something that only they can do and that they can do in a better way. So if an AI tool is really good at helping synthesize a conversation so they don't need to spend 30 minutes writing up a note after a patient encounter, maybe that's a good use. And instead, that clinician can use that time to have a human conversation. I don't want to, I worry that a lot of these tools, I think you said something like this earlier, but they're solutions looking for problems. And I think we need to flip that over. And we should only be using a tool when it's the right solution to a problem that's actually occurring.
Fair enough. And you anticipated the question that Gerald put in the Q&A box. And Larry, help us work through this, because this is really a tough one, because the notion of ambient recording and transcribing of patient encounters, which is what Emily referred to and what Gerald refers to in his questions, is one of the most hopeful areas of incorporating AI, as long as it doesn't, through complacency, lead to decision substitution about what needs to be in a patient encounter progress note. So Gerald says, physicians are utilizing an AI tool to record the discussion of symptoms with a patient, which can then be reviewed and edited into the EMR, hopefully. Then he says, this allows the physician to provide personal interaction rather than sit at the computer and type. Any ethical concerns? Question mark. Privacy concerns? Question mark. Larry, are there other industries that have encountered this computer system listening phenomenon that we in healthcare can learn from?
Yeah, I saw that comment too. It's really good. We're being recorded right now, aren't we?
Yeah, actually.
Every time that happens, I think, do I really want this recorded? Sometimes you get a choice and sometimes you don't. But I'm a big fan of LLMs if they're used properly, and I think that in the education in schools and stuff, we should really be showing people how to use them and not trying to catch them and keep them from using them, because there's some really good uses. And one of them, some of my friends in cybersecurity that doing routine work, they get these things that come to them, and they have to write up a report for somebody to look into it. And, they spend a lot of time thinking of how do I want to write this, but they're really easy just to put them into a report and send them to somebody to check it out. And they save a lot of time that way. Now that's a lot different than trying to write something that, or have ChatGPT write something that's creative. And I use ChatGPT, I think somebody asked, really to get ideas, and but I don't just take the ideas. They have to be an area where I already know if it's correct or not, or I can go look it up. But there may be things that, like, what are the top 10 things of something or other? I could, if I spent enough time, I could probably remember them. But if they're put in front of me, I can say, oh yeah, those are the ones, or not that one, but the others. But no, people aren't doing it that way. In the majority, I believe, they take whatever comes out and just trust it. So that's what we've got to. That's our challenge, is to get people to use it as an advanced Googling tool, which of course now Google even gives you an AI response. But you've got to get somebody or yourself to be able to know if it's correct or not, and that's our big challenge. And back to the recording of recording the patient and the doctor. The only thing I worry about is that a patient may not be comfortable having that recorded. First of all, they don't know who else is going to see it. Maybe it'll get released by accident. Maybe it'll get to their boss and they get fired. There are all kinds of problems there. But if you can provide the security, the privacy of that conversation, it is nice to have that to look at. Of course, doctors can remember things so well, but there might be some piece you missed, and when you look at the recording, and then you have it put into the record that way. But those are the things that popped in my mind when I saw that comment, is that some people won't feel comfortable having it recorded.
I also worry about I used it as an example as potentially a good thing that we could do, but I do have concerns, and I worry sometimes about AI output becoming the truth, whether it's right or wrong. And if it is really easy to imagine that a ambient monitoring algorithm could hear something wrong or contextualize it wrong, and then what looks like a authoritative transcript of what happened is now inaccurate. And I think that could be, I've seen it before in my own medical records outside of the AI context. Something in my record that said a doctor told me something, and I know that they didn't tell me that, but there it is forever that they had that conversation with me, and I found that personally upsetting. I can imagine if it was the patient's own words or experience getting muddled, that could be a problem too. So would this show up in the patient's record? I think they should be able to see it if it's going to be a part of their care and other people are going to be able to access it. Can they challenge it? Can they get it changed if it's not right? And also, if it becomes so commonplace that it's everywhere, I worry that it will be difficult for patients to say, actually, for this, I want to talk to you about something that's really sensitive and I don't want it recorded. Are you then going to have a big 5-minute kerfluffle of the person trying to figure out how to turn this off and not, it gets to the point where people will be uncomfortable asking for it not to be there. And I don't like that either. I worry about that as well.
So let me broaden the question, because the issue of the EMR is really another manifestation of our complacency concern. I wonder, what is an adequate progress note? How do we tell the algorithm, the large language model, to give us a thorough note of what the interaction between the doctor and the patient was, and not have it wind up being 50 pages long? And then, of course, if we tell the algorithm, give me a thorough progress note, but no more than 200 words, how do we judge what the algorithm is deciding to leave out? And the complacency issue is the physician now goes to look at the note maybe hours or days later to sign off on it, right? Because we want to have a human in the loop. And Larry said that we should never be letting these systems act on their own. What if the physician doesn't remember something that the patient said that didn't make it into the algorithm's note, but that is important to the next practitioner who encounters that patient? Is there a solution for that?
Like, do they live on a fifth floor walk-up?
Well, right, good. So team, what can we think optimistically could be a solution to that manifestation of automation complacency? Can we force the doctor to look at the computer generated note, right? It's going to spit out in a nanosecond immediately, and use his or her own memory of the encounter. And then, of course, to Emily's point, what if the patient says, oh, I don't want you to use the ambient recording for this encounter? Then we have a clinician whose skills have gotten a little mushy on how to write a note for themselves. So what do we do with this? Michael, you want to grab that one first?
Yeah, I think it goes to something Yoel said, or maybe it was Yoel who talked about having multiple stakeholders potentially even in the room. It's not just the physician or the patient. In this case, it's also maybe not just the AI. It could be family. Or I guess if there's a privacy concern, maybe not family. But the point is just having a diverse set of stakeholders when you're deciding or receiving or information's being input. So you may know, or at least have another opinion to draw on, which I think is kind of a takeaway for a lot of this, is just having another opinion to draw on. And whether it's another expert or it's someone who may have the sociocultural knowledge of a patient, or it's a hard data set. So I would take that probably away is just no shortage of stakeholders.
Indeed. Anyone else? Camille, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I really like that, Michael, as well, especially if you think of the more relational context of, for example, South Africa. The other thing that I also thought was, when I read Gerald's question, I was wondering about, how do we mean record? Do we mean video recording? Do we mean audio recording? There could also be layers to that. Or the doctor could also, have a drop-down list of symptoms, and they could just be filling those in and giving that to the AI model, and then they could still, the AI model could still connect the dots, something that the doctor might have missed or not missed, but that the doctor kind of inputs the information, and that the patient also might get an opportunity to input information, and that be recorded. Yeah.
I was interested too, and from some of the legal minds here, if there was a lawsuit about something that went wrong, would they have access to the recording of that?
That is a major concern, and that concern escalates, to Camille's point, when we start using video in addition to audio in the patient encounter. And actually my closing polemic is on that subject. But let's deal with this liability and responsibility issue, because Ruth asks, Ruth says, as a hospital attorney, there are multiple contractual considerations when using AI: responsibility for error, tolerance of error rate, who owns it, and responsibility for the error's impact, in effect, the harm that's created. And, I've thought about this a lot. It's a topic of frequent discussions at lots and lots of conferences we've all been attending. Where I come down on this, tell me if you think I'm wrong, liability has to rest with whomever decided to plug the thing in, right? Because any one user might be in a position to say, well, I was told it had this check, or I was told that this output of the AI was going to be reviewed by another human being. I was relying on that. I think ultimately the person who has to be both morally and legally responsible for making sure that everyone who uses one of these LLMs knows what the negative impacts might be is the person who decided to implement it, to both literally and metaphorically plug the device in. Thoughts, arguments? Am I wrong?
Just one observation was that we assumed that there's a recording, which is not necessarily the case. I think you could design a system so that the counter happens, it gets processed, and then the recording is purged. It could be a way of dealing with privacy concerns, but on the other hand, if someone then sees an error and says, no, I didn't say that, there's nothing for them to reference and go back to. But yeah, I'm absolutely certain that companies offering these services will have contracts that disclaim any liability.
And we ought not to sign those contracts. I think that's another instance of complacency we ought to guard against. I might add to Emily's point that HIPAA, the Health Insurance Privacy and Accountability Act, our medical privacy law, does give patients the right to challenge information that is erroneous and to put a comment or a response in. But if the recording has been purged, that would be a hard thing to do. There's also the reality that you are, in effect, destroying a record by deleting that recording. I think there are lots of problems there. Yoel, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just think that that's a very good starting point, that whoever plugged the thing in is accountable. But I don't think it needs to end there. Like there are like good and very bad ways of using different tools, and maybe just like having some sort of like sense of accountability also on the user, like articulated when the thing is put into operation or integrated in the system, kind of also helps to keep that index of suspicion more elevated, like not to fall into the complacency trap if there's this sense of like personal accountability of like being mindful of using the application correctly.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, Ken asked the question or comments that we should think about or say something about the role of hospital systems in codifying their own ethical standards. And I think he's right. I don't believe it's that the legal system has no ability to deal with this. There will be lawsuits and there will be settlements and judgments. But to my point earlier, whomever plugs the thing in has both a legal and an ethical obligation to make sure that everyone is going to utilize it knows what the system's limitations are. And at the end of the day, only the hospital or health system can do that, because no one has that 30,000-foot perspective on what reliances will there be along the chain of custody of the patient's care to flesh out what could be the unintended and really innocent misreliances on an AI generated system. Thoughts?
Yeah, I tend to agree. I had a little bit of a different answer before I heard you and Yoel speak about this, and now I'm thinking a little bit more along those lines, as it seems the most practical to have the liability fall on the hospital system. My instinct would tell me it would be going to the designers of these systems, and of course they're protected by all sorts of legal nomenclature that prevents them from assuming any liability. But even if you were to go all the way to the designer, as much as I advocate for, programming tech from the ground up and ensuring that value is programmed in with multiple stakeholders and cross collaboration from the very beginning. Even if you were to go to the designer, that computer scientist or whoever coded the LLM might just immediately point to the CEO and say, well, I was told to, design my system with, maybe a more likelihood to administer a certain drug out. So it really, it's a rabbit hole. And I think that's scary as well.
It is indeed. I think what we can take away from this as our group and our audience is that there are lots of issues to think about that maybe people haven't even been aware of. And if we've accomplished that tonight, then we've accomplished a lot. For the lawyers in the audience, the second participation code is ethics, a fitting place to end. And more on this topic to come from Columbia and from my friends and colleagues for sure. If you're interested in these kinds of discussions, we do these programs frequently. Our next one is December 2nd. My colleague Barbara Rothschild will be moderating a discussion about the definition of brain death with a really remarkable panel that will look at whether our current notion of brain death is now outdated, and who knows what AI will think of the definition of brain death. I guess we'll find out in time. I want to thank all of you. This has been a terrific discussion, and our audience for their great questions. Please do stay tuned. If you want more of this, or if you have follow-up questions, feel free to reach out to me. I will share your questions with the panel, and we'll get back to you. And thank you, and good night.
Thank you all so much. Sorry we couldn't answer all the questions, but great night.
Yeah.
Good night, all.
Thank you.
Thank you.